Does the panel think we should have endpoint assessment? Is it needed or should it be replaced with something else?
It's obviously a very broad question and covers a lot of ground, so perhaps, Tom, I could ask you to kick off.
Thanks, Stewart. You know, I always like to give a direct answer to a direct question. So the short answer from me is absolutely yes, we should keep endpoint assessment. And you know, frankly, it horrifies me, the idea of yet another major reform around apprenticeships. When you do the last part of that question, there should be replace it with something else. I think there are people in this room who've been through probably too many replacements over the years, including myself, around skills policy. But I think it goes back to actually one of the metaphors that was used in the review that kicked off these reforms back in 2013. Some of you may remember it was the driving test metaphor. So that, the notion that, you know, we wouldn't accept people learning to drive without taking an independent exam at the end of it. And actually, it's a really good metaphor because if you think about it, the driving schools and the driving instructors are your training providers and colleges that actually deliver the training. And there's a huge array of choice and diversity out there as to who does the training. And likewise then, when you are ready to go for your test, and some of us here probably passed first time, and some of us probably took a few more times than that, but the point is there was that end point when you or your instructor decided you were ready to go and you booked in at the examination centre and you went for that test. And that gives then the public confidence and other fellow drivers and pedestrians that we've reached a standard of driving. I think there's a whole different debate about whether or not we always have that standard of driving on our roads, but that's the whole point, I think, of endpoint assessment. It's to give the employer, the individual apprentice, but also society as a whole, confidence that when somebody goes through that endpoint assessment, they are absolutely proficient and competent in what they do. And it is, as Stewart was saying, a cornerstone of the reforms, and I believe we've really got to make it work.
Sharon, I wonder if you could give an employer perspective to that?
Absolutely. So for us at Coca-Cola, we are only just about to go through our first endpoint assessment. So to change it now, I think would be a bit of a challenge for us, in all honesty. I was with some operations directors a couple of weeks ago, and we were trying to explain the driving test to them, and they were like, this is fantastic, we really, really love it. Can we use the assessment for some people who aren't going through an apprenticeship? Because if that's supposed to be the standard and the benchmark, surely that's what we should be benchmarking our other employees against. So if we were then to come along now and go, really sorry, that thing we've only just gone through, we're now going to change it, I think the business would be in uproar, in all honesty, because we don't know what we don't know at the moment, so let's go with what's there.
So I'm an endpoint assessment organisation, and we're at a stage where we've had 400 endpoint assessments now taken place, which seems not many, but actually it's quite a few when we look at where we are overall. So I think the independent side, if we want parity, then endpoint assessment is a good thing, but there are some things that would need to be changed if we are going to all make this a success. So I've got my 4 C's, sorry, but I'm just hoping that I'll get a bit of momentum with these 4 C's. So the first is around clarity. There's actually a number of parts of the endpoint assessment where people aren't sure who's responsible for what. We take invigilation, we take venues, and oh gosh, there's a whole list of examples. And I think actually that clarity of who's responsible for what is something that we need to fight for the apprentice, employer, provider, and for endpoint assessment organisations. I think consistency is another one. I'm speaking to employers where in some situations I'm able to say that there are resits that can take place. In other situations, I'm saying actually you can't have resits there. That's a really difficult message to take out. So we do actually need some consistency when we're looking at those areas. I think capacity is actually been underestimated. We've got lots of people who have been assessors previously who are training now to become endpoint assessors, but we're in a new world. I'm going to take some of my retail employers. There isn't necessarily the technology within stores. Actually, the thought that multiple choice questions would all be done online, that's not necessarily always possible. There's some places that aren't necessarily equipped for those endpoint assessments to take place. That's all different challenges that endpoint assessors and also employers are having to face. So that additional burden on employers, I think, hasn't yet been fully understood. And costings, we know there's been a number of cuts that have come out in relation to the delivery of apprenticeships. That also impacts, if you take the 20% rule, on the cost of assessment. But is anybody actually turned around and said, what is the true cost of this delivery? And actually, what is the true cost of the assessment without actually just applying a blanket rule?
Do you find the employers are happy with the principle of EPA?
I think there's been a lot of people, employers, who have been behind apprenticeships for a long period of time, and even with the levy coming in, they were just actually, this is another opportunity for our businesses. That's a difficult thing now we're actually in it. They've said I can use them as an example, so I will. So BT is one of our clients who have always supported apprenticeships. Actually, now they're feeling that pressure of more ownership on team leaders to actually get coverage when other endpoint assessment is taking place, be involved in the scheduling. On average, our assessors are having to make around 7 phone calls to get through to the right person within that employer. So it's more of a challenge actually for the employers, and is that additional burden yet fully understood? And I'm sure that's something you're yet to find out and discover.
No, absolutely. So we've got our training provider coming in because they said, oh, it's fine, it'll be okay. I'm like, we've never been through one, so how do I know it's going to be okay? Yep. And that's just the start of it.
Yeah.
Okay. Richard, perhaps a perspective from a provider.
Yeah, sure. So we've had 25 learners go through endpoint assessment, 23 of whom have been successful. So we've got a small experience, and yeah, it's worked. You know, it's physically worked. We've got 250 though between now and Christmas, and 1,000 next year. So that'll be the real test. You know, will it work? Will it work at volume? And I think we can already see that it will act as a restriction on the take-up of apprenticeships, because it makes us more cautious around starting learners if we're not sure the capacity is there. And I think the principle and the policy can be seen to work. I think they were looking for 2 things in the Richard review that Tom talks about. One is to make apprenticeships more definite, you know, when you've passed or failed. Because apprentices never used to fail. Apprenticeships on frameworks and MVQs don't fail. They give up, they change job, they have a baby, they do something different. They don't fail, you know, and they just kind of drop off or stay with it. With standards, with endpoint, there'll be a pass or fail, so it'll be a bit more definitive. And the other thing, really, that they wanted to introduce was a bit more rigor, you know, and have a higher bar. And I think that's probably there too. Where I think it's difficult is the practicalities. So there isn't the capacity to do 300,000 endpoint assessments a year. So if that's the new norm of apprenticeship volumes in England, you know, there isn't the capacity. There won't be the capacity for that. So there has to be some delegation of roles to providers, intermediaries or others to do some of the legwork. Otherwise it will be a constraint on volumes. And I think government have recognised that. If you look at universities, they've been allowed to do their own endpoint assessments, haven't they, through the integrated model? And I think that others will have to be allowed to do their own endpoint assessment too. Otherwise we'll run out and it'll become a blocker to
That's a very valid point. Maybe something we'll come back to it. Eric, did you want to just...
Picking up on that point, I think it was in an article that I read that you wrote, actually, Tom, where you quoted, I can't remember the name of the person, but it's basically saying that training providers shouldn't be marking their own homework. So I think having...
To Jerry,
yes,
the IFA.
So I think, and we are an endpoint assessment organisation as well, and we did our first cohort last year for the broadcast production assistant. And I think I'm in agreement that there should be an endpoint assessment process. I think there is a lot of work to be done to stabilise it, but it is a fairly new process for many providers. I know Trailblazers were involved earlier, but for the vast majority of us, we didn't start delivering standards till maybe last year when the levy kicked in. So there will be a lot of teething problems. But I think in principle, It is important, but I think the relationship between the endpoint assessment organisation and the provider needs to be established very, very early on. And I personally don't think a standard should be published as ready to be delivered unless there is an endpoint assessment organisation in place and they've been able to develop their assessment materials, their price and policy, and then you can say we're good to go.
Of course, quite a number of those things get picked up, certainly in terms of not the split of duties between training providers and assessment organisations, but clearly they need to work very closely together. And there's a lot of the assessment process that is administration and contacts, and we've just got to find the best way of doing that on behalf of the employers and the apprentices. If apprentices are ready for their assessment but it doesn't get done because for whatever reason it doesn't get organised, we need to be conscious of that.